The Trappist monk, mystic, peace activist, and writer Thomas Merton wrote about how he decided to pursue saintliness. One night, he and a friend were walking along 6th Avenue in New York City. The subway was being dug. The street was all torn up. There were banks of dirt marked out by red lanterns, lining the sidewalks and piled up high in front of the shops. This was the 1940s. It was before Merton became a monk and long before he became famous. He was still a young man. Merton and his friend, someone who went on to become a noted poet himself, were arguing passionately about something. Suddenly, Merton's friend turned to him and asked, "What do you want to be, anyway?" Merton recalls his answer. "I could not say. I could not say I want to be Thomas Merton, the well-known writer of all those book reviews that appear in the back pages of the New York Times, or Thomas Merton, the assistant instructor of English. So I put the thing where I thought it belonged, on the spiritual plane." Then Merton tried to formulate his response. He said, "I don't know. I guess I want to be a good Catholic." Merton's friend was not satisfied with the answer. "What do you mean you want to be a good Catholic?" Merton admitted that he was confused. And so his friend continued to needle at him. "What you should say," Merton's friend informed him, "what you should say is that you want to be a saint." "A saint? How do you expect me to be a saint?" was Merton's reply. "By wanting to," his friend said simply. Merton was filled with self-doubt. "I can't be a saint. I can't be a saint," he answered back. He recounts that in that moment, "my mind darkened with a confusion of realities and unrealities, the knowledge of my own sins, and the false humility which makes men say that they cannot do the things that they must do, cannot reach the level that they must. In other words, cowardice." Merton's friend would have none of it. He told him, no, all that is necessary to be a saint is to want to be one. Don't you believe that God will make you what he created you to be, if you will consent him to do it? All you have to do is desire it. Merton described this story in his classic spiritual book, The 7-Story Mountain. It was the first major work that he published. For many people, especially of the Vietnam War generation, he went on to become exactly the person who his friend was prompting him to be, a saint. Now, Merton's Catholic theistic theology might not resonate with most of you, but his narrative touches upon the theme of our sermon this morning. This is my second sermon to you on courage. We might define courage as the midpoint between fear and confidence. We exhibit courage when we acknowledge our fears, admit that there are ills which might befall us, and then act anyway. Merton did exactly that when he decided to pursue sainthood. Last week, I spoke with you about collective courage. Collective courage being the way that we collectively face our fears and struggle to find new ways of being. It's expressed in the 17th century Universalist saying, "The world turned upside down." It's the act of working together to confront social crises, great and small, and then attempting to reorder society. This week, I want to speak with you about individual courage. What I mean here is finding the courage to become the person you feel called to be. The theologian Paul Tillich wrote about finding the courage to be. We humans are born with the knowledge that we will die. We witness the mortality of others and realize that death will come for all of us. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but each breath draws us closer to our moment of expiration. This can understandably make us anxious. No matter what we do, no matter how carefully we eat, no matter how much we exercise, no matter how many doctors we consult, the threat of death is something we cannot overcome. The basic anxiety, the anxiety of finite being about the threat of non-being, cannot be eliminated. It belongs to existence itself, wrote Tillich. In the face of our impending individual extinction, it takes courage to continue along with life. And it takes even greater courage to be and to attempt to become, to recognize ourselves as poised on the existential void and still try to live a life of authenticity. For Merton, it took an extraordinary amount of courage to pursue the vision of sainthood that he found with his friend in that New York City night, and meant rejecting all of the anxiety that told him he could not or would not or was unable to or would never achieve anything, that his life was too insignificant. Instead, it meant somehow moving past all of that and coming to recognize, in his words, "For me to be a saint means to be myself." The courage of becoming has long been prized in our Unitarian Universalist tradition. In the 19th century, the Unitarian theologian James Walker preached, "We are not born with character, good or bad, but only with the capacity to form one." Our characters might be described as the total sum of our virtues and vices. Virtues are those things about us which are praiseworthy. They are the accretions of our actions. Our actions become our habits, and then eventually our habits turn to virtues or vices, and these become our characters. And we Unitarian Universalists have long taught that we are not born with our character fixed in place, not born wicked, as many a conservative religious tradition teaches, but rather we are born with the capacity to become, the capacity to develop our virtues and vices. Thomas Aquinas, the 12th century theologian, identified 4 principal virtues. These are wisdom, temperance, justice, and courage. Over the next several months, we will explore how to develop the spiritual resources that will allow us to address the grave crises of the hour and the crises of our own lives by examining some of these virtues. We've started with courage because developing the courage to be is essential if we are to pursue the other virtues. William Ellery Channing, the great Unitarian theologian of the 19th century, wrote that the courage to become ourselves might even be called the perfection of humanity, for it is the exercise, result, and expression of our highest attributes, of the highest attributes of our nature. When we find it, we open ourselves to the rich possibilities of life and confront the truth that we have the responsibility for forming our own characters. The Reverend Bob Shibley used to remind this congregation of this truth. During the 2 decades he served here, he often told you some variety of, "Life does not have a meaning. We give life its meaning. Or rather, we give our lives meaning." Bob's death this week prompted me to go read a number of his old sermons. In reading them, I found that he also often told you some variant of, "You already have within you what it is you need, and what it is that we who know you need, and what all living things in the world need." The recognition that life does not have intrinsic meaning, the realization that we are born with what we need to pass our time on this muddy planet. It takes courage to face these truths starkly. It takes courage to admit them and then open ourselves to the possibility of becoming ourselves. I spent a portion of this summer thinking about courage. As some of you know, Asa and I were in Europe for about 5 weeks, visiting with my parents. You might remember that everyone else in my family is in the arts. My father is a noted art historian and photographer. My mother was a ceramicist in her younger years, and then after she retired from teaching elementary school, served on museum boards. She incidentally makes my stoles. My brother is a figurative painter, his girlfriend is a fashion designer, and my daughter is pursuing a career in fashion photography. So traveling with my parents always means being immersed in the arts. We spent about a week this summer in Arles, France, at the giant international photography festival there. It's even larger than Houston's Photo Fest. It brings close to 100,000 people to the small medieval city where Van Gogh painted. It's a premier event in the arts world, a bit akin to the Cannes Film Festival. And my parents go most years, but this year was very special. One of their closest friends, the Czech photographer Libouše Jarkovič, was one of the featured artists. She was given the former St. Anne's Church, the premier exhibition space at the festival. The building has been stripped of all of its religious iconography, and there's a beautiful blonde wooden floor. The side chapels and the nave have been converted into a gallery that allowed her to exhibit more than 200 of her images. Now, Libouše is about the same age as my parents, and this was her first major show. And it would be something of an understatement to say that it was a smash success. During the week that we were together in Arles, there were major articles about her work in the New York Times, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, and The Guardian. Walking around Arles with her was what I imagine walking through Cannes is like with a well-known director or screenwriter. People stopped us on the street or came up to us and introduced themselves to Libouše as we ate in French cafes. And it would be fair to say that Libouše was in a bit of a state of shock. In the space of a week, she went from being completely unknown to being an international art celebrity. And there are two things about Libouše and courage that I want to share with you. The first is about her art itself, and the second is about her tenacious insistence that she was an artist. Libouše's photography comes straight from her life. It's a record of her courageous becoming, which is no small thing. You see, as I mentioned earlier, she's Czech, and she came of age in communist Czechoslovakia. She's also queer, and to put it mildly, being a queer artist was not a form of authenticity that was tolerated by the Marxist-Leninist officials. And yet, over the course of more than 20 years, she took thousands of black and white photos documenting her life, the lives of those she loved, and the lives of those she happened to encounter. She used photography to make sense of her life. She told me, "Sometimes I was involved in very complicated situations. I used photography to get some distance from myself and to make sense of them." The images that garnered the most attention were from the Tea Club, which was one of only 2 gay clubs in Prague during the communist era. Never entirely legal, Libouše describes it as a place for convulsive laughter and genuine tears, one-night stands and love for life, beautiful young men and beautiful young women, effeminate and respectable-looking gentlemen who were abounded from their families, female footballers, waiters, taxi drivers, and most probably the secret police, too. In this place of internal carnival, as she described it, people were able to find the courage to be themselves. And Libouše took pictures of them living that courage. This Transgender Awareness Week, one image in particular stands out. It's of a young postman from North Bohemia who traveled to Prague to visit the Tea Club. He felt that he had been born in the wrong gender, that he was truly a woman. But gender transition was not possible for him in that repressive society. And yet, there is Le Boucher's photograph. In it, the young postman appears as the woman he longs to be, as the woman he truly believes he is. She's wearing a blonde wig, flirting with the camera, beaming in a long fur coat, courageously, fully being herself. Le Boucher's empathy for the subject pops right out of the frame. I can only imagine the courage that was necessary to both take the photograph and be its subject. It was quite possible that either act could have cost the photographer or her subject their livelihood. For Le Boucher, even the attempt to be an artist took courage. You see, she came from an artistic family. Both her parents were artists, but they were not the kind of artists approved by the Communist Party. They painted modern abstract canvases, which were denounced as deviant art. The party wanted social realism, which depicted working people living idealized lives under the Marxist-Leninist regime. When Le Boucher graduated from high school, the party had its revenge upon her parents. They made her undergo what was called forced proletization. In her words, they denied her a college education and tried to make her become a factory worker. She wanted to be an artist like her parents, and she did not give up the courage to become. Instead, she told the factory officials that while she worked in the factory, she wanted to document the glorious life of working people under the party's leadership. So she took her camera and made photographs of people at work. But she didn't do it in service of the regime. Instead of nobly showing workers toiling away, she took photographs of them engaging in their everyday acts of resistance, goofing off, napping, ignoring supervisors, or doing whatever else it was when they showed up to the factory and did not work. I particularly like the images she made of the creative ways people found to sleep at work. Sleeping under desks, in giant steel tubes, or behind piles of wooden crates. It took a lot of courage for Le Boucher to make such defiant photographs. Finding this courage was necessary for her to be herself, to become an artist when her society explicitly told her she could not be one. It also helped her to develop a sense of courage, a sense that courage and beauty are found in everyday life. In conversation with me, she explained a bit of her philosophy. Doing photographs of such normal, ordinary things seems like it might be boring, but photography changes things. Life is changing so fast that this ordinary thing will be very important. You don't need to have some extraordinary adventure. You just need to be present every day, present to normal, everyday life, and that is very special. It takes courage to recognize the specialness of ordinary life. None of us will probably be famous religious teachers like Thomas Merton, and none of us will probably end up as internationally known artists like Le Boucher. But we can find the courage to be ourselves. After all, this is what both Le Boucher and Thomas Merton recommend to us. It is also what the virtue of courage offers us. When we cultivate it, we find it within ourselves the ability to shape our character. We are born not good or bad, but with the ability to choose. And in order to choose, we must do so courageously. Now, I will admit that I initially thought about ending our sermon here. But the events of the week require further observations about the courage of being. I speak, of course, of the week's impeachment hearings. They have demonstrated extraordinary instances of the courage to be civil servants. The men and women who have testified in front of the nation have offered case studies in how we shape our own characters. They have each decided upon a profession and then performed its actions, cultivated its habits, and ultimately found themselves embodying its virtues. It's clear that one of the virtues of their profession is courage. In the face of intimidation by the most powerful man on earth, the President of the United States, Marie Yovanovitch, the former ambassador to Ukraine, testified on national television. In a telephone call, the President of the United States had said to the President of the Ukraine that he was displeased with Yovanovitch and that she would go through some things, in his words. Words which I have to say reminded me of mafia movies. Yet there she was, in front of the world, offering information that may well lead to the impeachment of that very president. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre observed, "To be courageous is to be someone upon whom reliance can be placed." And in her testimony, Yovanovitch demonstrated that whomever the president might be, she can be relied upon to perform her duties as a civil servant. It was a demonstration of how she had cultivated the virtue of courage. It was a demonstration of the courage of being, of embracing the role, the profession she had chosen for herself. Her testimony reminded me of words by the civil rights organizer Ella Baker. Baker said, "I am here, and so are you, and we matter, and we can change things." Baker's words are an invocation of the courage of being. They remind us that we are here and that what we do matters. It takes courage to accept this, courage to admit, as Bob Shibley taught from this pulpit, that we make the meaning we find in life. Yovanovitch was reminding the world that civil servants play a significant role in the federal government. However much the President of the United States might slight her and her State Department colleagues, they remained actively involved in shaping the destiny of the country. And their professional virtues, of which courage is but one, are a significant reason as to why. Not all of us are civil servants, just as not all of us are artists or great religious teachers. And yet there is something about courage, the courage to be, that can be found in the lives of each person I've talked about this morning that recommends itself to each of you. It takes courage to recognize that within ourselves we have the potential to be something, and then courage to reach out for that something. It is the ordinary courage of life, not something extraordinary, and it is something that we can find within each of us. That is what Leboucher tries to communicate with her photography. Her work is not of important religious leaders like Thomas Merton or successful government officials like Marie Yovanovitch. It's of regular working people like the woman from Bohemia dressed in her furs outside the tea club, finding a space to courageously be the woman she knew she was, despite having to live as a postman. It is of regular working people discovering the courage to be their human selves amid the brutal Marxist-Leninist regime, the courage to goof off at work or to sleep on the job. Can you find the courage to be and become? Such courage might mean admitting that you are uncertain of who you are supposed to be and living with that ambiguity. That is something of what Bob Shibley suggested in many of his sermons. Before we find the courage to be, we must first discover the courage to recognize that it is we who make the meaning of our lives. And sometimes in places, this is much easier to recognize than in others. Living in New York, the child of relative wealth and privilege, it was no doubt easier for Thomas Merton to accept that he could become who he wanted to be than it was for Leboucher in the 1970s Prague. Finding the courage to be a queer dissident artist under the Soviets and refusing to let the officials of the totalitarian regime tell people who they were going to be and make the meaning of their lives was extraordinarily difficult. It meant creating in secrecy without recognition for decades. And yet, she found that courage, found the courage to be. Can you find the courage to be and become? Have you found it? Can you accept that we make the meaning we have in our lives? It is a significant responsibility. And it means accepting that our ordinary lives, yours and mine, can contain the meaning we give them. We might be hemmed in on many sides. We might not come from lives of privilege or have the advantages of a fine education or struggle with poverty. But we can find the courage to be and discover within ourselves the resources to make meaning. And to accept that such meaning will change over time. It's like Bob Shibley said, at different times, the meaning of your life may have been to do God's will, or to do justice, or to love mercy, or to enjoy the fruits of creation, to complete your education, to raise your children, or to get those kids through school. Your meaning is your own if you can cultivate the courage to make it. This belies the universe necessarily having a discernible cosmic meaning. And it takes courage to face such ambiguity, as the poet Cristina Peri Rossi wrote. Se necesita mucho valor para tanta muerte inútil. One needs a lot of courage for so much useless death. Death, like life, is only given the meaning we provide it. It takes courage to face that and to give our lives and ultimately our deaths meaning. And so let me give the last words to Bob Shibley, who gave his life and his death meaning in part by serving this congregation, Unitarian Universalism, and the wider world. You already have within you what it is you need, what it is we who know you need, and what all the living things in the world need. May we, as members of this congregation and as members of the great family of all souls, cultivate within ourselves the courage to find what we need as we hear them within Bob Shibley's words. And now I invite the congregation to say, Amen.